it looks like most of you have your coffee and donuts, so we'll go ahead and get started. If at any point you need to refill, go right ahead. You're welcome to do that. I want to just say a brief word about what has led to this point, and then I'll open with prayer and we'll let John come up. And in case I forget to mention this, which I'm sure I will, we have a copy of the report that we want to put in your hands. Metaphorically speaking, we'd like to share it mostly electronically because it's several pages long. We will send an email out after today with an electronic copy of that document. If you prefer not to have an electronic copy, we've got a stack of about 40 of them at the back. You can pick them out on your way out. And if you don't get one and you really would like a hard copy afterwards, you can come talk to me. So the process that led us to this point is that we, as you know, have been looking at our building for years now and recognizing things that need to be addressed and need to be improved. And that has dovetailed with conversation about the work of the church and what we're doing or trying to do. And ultimately, after a lot of conversation among the Finance and Facilities Committee, as well as the session, we decided to bring in a consultant to help us with this process, to help us think through what we are capable of doing and what direction we ought to be going. We interviewed a handful of consultants, and we settled on John Laster, who has a background as a minister, but he's been in this work for 14 years. Is that right, John? And one of the things that was an important point for us in choosing John and his company is the feasibility study that he includes, that really he requires as a part of this process. And that is what has brought us here today. John has had in-person conversations with dozens of folks. We sent out a survey to the whole congregation. I know many of you took the time to fill that out and send it in, so thank you to all of you who have done that. John has met with our finance committee, he's met with our session, and so he's here now to share this report with us. And as I said in worship, it goes far beyond the finances of the church, and it's a really important conversation for us to be having right now. So I'm really glad that you're here. Thank you for taking the time to stay today and to hear what John has to say. And I'm going to pray so that we can trust that God is here with us, guiding this process. So let's pray. Lord, we are here because we love you, and we are here because we love your church. We ask for the guidance and wisdom of your Spirit as we discern together what the next chapter of our life as the body of Christ here in Milford looks like. Thank you for John, the gifts that he brings, and for the time that he is giving us, and for his presence here today. We ask your blessing on all of this, and it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Oh, you don't need one.
I think I'm wired.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank, to begin with, all of you who served as my informants, helping me understand First Presbyterian Church, Milford Presbyterian Church, excuse me. Such a blessing to be with you this morning. I greatly value the opportunity to be present in a congregation where there's life and vitality. I don't see that everywhere I go, so it's very, very encouraging. Let me say to begin with that I very much appreciate and am thankful for your session and other leaders who saw fit to have confidence in me to come alongside the church to this point. I don't take that confidence lightly. I know what it is to be a church leader. I know what it is to be a pastor and to serve. And I also know what it is to have somebody come in and poke around in your church, so to speak. It can be a little bit uncomfortable at best. So, thank you. What I want to do today is to give you a brief overview of what we've found here at Milford Presbyterian. The purpose of this exercise, this feasibility study, is to see below the waterline and try and discern some factors that might be inhibiting your navigation forward. I think this congregation has a bright future, and I'll say a little bit more about that. If we don't look below the waterline, we can be deceived very easily in thinking that the way forward is pretty clear. But often it's not when we're on a journey. The projects in question, I want to highlight those very briefly. An accessible front entrance. Modernize the main lobby, I think including the approach to the sanctuary. Those are impressive stairs. They really are. But they're stairs. It reminds me of the church in which I grew up in Southfield, except their stairs were outside Southfield, right? From December through whenever the weather breaks, along about May 15th, I guess. It was pretty dicey down there. The idea is to open up and freshen up the lower level, to do some updating in this fine space, floor covering and other updates, and to put in a full-size elevator and to create some energy efficiency through new boilers and upgrades to windows and to lighting. I want to tip my hand a little bit right off the bat and say that I believe personally, and I'm certainly not suggesting that anyone needs to or ought to agree with me, but I believe very strongly that accessibility is a justice issue. I'll never forget when that Presbyterian church in Southfield told my mom she wasn't welcome anymore. Now, they didn't come right out and say that, but as my mom's health began to decline, it was unsafe for her, even with help, to try and navigate those stairs outside that church. And so, through inaction, that church told my mom, "You're not really welcome here." We thought about carrying her up, and quickly saw the foolishness in that. But anyway, I digress. The project costs here range between $500,000 and $1 million. That's a lot of money. It boils down to between 1.37 and 2.75 times the giving, actual giving, in 2016. The important factor to remember when you're doing evaluations of what's possible is to make sure that you factor against giving, not against the annual budget. Now, I know that those two figures are close here, but some congregations have significant input from other sources beyond their giving. And so you need to think about your giving as relates to the project costs. So I want to say that these are not out of the realm of possibility. The churches that I've worked with over the last 14 years on capital projects tend to fall out somewhere between 1.3 and 3.7-ish times annual giving in terms of what they're able to raise in a capital campaign, with the higher end of that factor range being churches that are really dialed in, and there's a lot of discernible momentum in churches that are raising upwards of 1.5, 2 times plus their annual giving. I want to say that as we're moving through different pieces of this study, if you have any questions, raise your hand, try and get my attention, and we'll deal with it right then. I will offer a time for questions at the end, but I'd really rather capture any thoughts or questions that you have right in the moment. I have a hard time with coffee and talking and all that all at once, but at any rate.
Set that coffee down.
Well, I'm going to be out of the... Thanks for that. Anyway, here's our process. I interviewed 45 people comprising 29 households. We sent out a survey to the remainder of the congregation, as Bryant mentioned. I had 41 households who responded. We interacted with a total of 71 households who participated. That boils down to 20.8% of your active member families. Okay? So a pretty good cross-section. But the important point was that we wanted to give everyone, should they so choose, an opportunity to participate in the process and to be heard. Let me say this, just about the process in general. If I was a pastor again in the local church, one of the things that I would do about every 2, maybe 3 years at the outside is I would create an opportunity, it really doesn't matter what it is, but I would create an opportunity and have someone come in and listen to my people. Because what I've realized in the years of doing this work with Horizon Stewardship and then with a group called Eason, Bandy and Associates prior to that focused mostly on church turnaround and leadership development work, what I've learned is that people will tell you things that you never imagined if you only asked them. And it's helpful if that person is an outsider. It'd be difficult for the pastor to sit down with people like I did and get the kind of candor that I think I got from you all. So anyway, that's free. I want to say that you have amazing potential here. Amazing. You have 469 people who've made a covenant between themselves and this church and God, a covenant of membership. I want to light a fire today, if I can, not literally, although that would be an insurance claim, I imagine. At any rate, I'm not advocating anything incendiary quite like that, but the point is you have incredible potential with 469 members. Think about what it's going to be like when each one of those people, plus your constituents, people who are in orbit around the church here, think about what it's going to be like when those 469 plus people have a place to belong and a place to serve right here, rooted in this beachhead, if you will, that we call Milford Presbyterian Church. It's exciting to think about. Now, in 2017, you recorded 169 average worship attendance. Further, well, that's 36% of your members are represented in that average worship attendance number. That gives you an incredible amount of room to grow and develop as you engage more people. Now, worship attendance has declined 13.3% since 2013. And I'll have to admit to you that I had a lot of questions about that walking in here today, and those questions were answered for me this morning. I'm wondering how your planning is going, Bryant, and members of the session, for your next service. Because your current service, I don't know if today was out of whack or out of the norm, but one of the reasons that very well could be contributing to that decline is that you're full on Sunday morning. Your sanctuary, in my professional opinion, is significantly beyond 80% full. When you're 80% full, you're turning away guests. Now, I knew there had to be a place for me, because I mean, I'm not as little as I used to be, but I can kind of shoehorn in here and there. but your first impression is you're full, there's not a place for you. Now, I know and you know that devout Presbyterians will shoehorn their way in just anywhere they can find a little bit of space for their seat there. But guests will not. Especially guests who may be walking into a place like this, some for the first time ever, perhaps, others for the first time in a long, long time. Some of you know about the rise of the nuns in our culture, people who will respond on a survey that they're none of the above. They're not Catholic, they're not Protestant, they're not really an atheist, they're just nothing. One of the most exciting things about our culture today is that the research shows that the culture is spiritually hungry, but institutionally alienated. I take that as an incredible opportunity. Now, I work a lot in the main line. Disciples of Christ, Lutherans, Presbyterians, a lot of United Methodist work. And one of the retorts that I hear often, which is a falsehood actually, but people say, young people aren't interested in religion. That's how you account for the shrinking worship numbers and the graying of the folks that you might see in a pew on Sunday. Well, it's not at all true that young people aren't interested in religion. They're very spiritually minded as a general rule, but they've been taught by their experience, or in some cases the experience of their parents, that one of the things you want to stay away from, sort of like the bubonic plague, is a church. What we need to do as the people of God is to take up that tabernacle image that was preached about this morning and get out and about being salt and light and leaven in our community, because people are spiritually hungry. They just, when they think about organized religion, they think, well, there's nothing there for them. Now, I'm an old fart, according to my kids. Some of my younger kids still have enough respect for their father to not say that, at least to me. Some of the older kids are pretty open about how they think and feel. But the point is, when I grew up in the 60s, it was still very, very common to go to a place like this routinely. Weddings, funerals, sometimes community gatherings, depending on the community. Those days are gone. It's been a long time since I've been in a church for a wedding. My kids that have gotten married already, we didn't do their service in a church. None of the three that have gotten married so far. They got married in other places. And it's increasingly rare for there to be funerals in churches, in many communities. I can't speak for Milford. But the point is that ongoing routine sort of exposure that people once had, kind of back in the old days, of exposure to a church, those opportunities aren't available anymore. All right, I digress a lot. You had 110 households that pledged to the mission and ministry of this church in 2017. I want to share this with you. Your giving per member is low, $770.32 a year. That in and of itself is not a concern to me. What is a concern to me is that this number is 27.6% lower than the PCUSA average. Now let me just say, with all due respect to averages, the PCUSA average is absolutely nothing to write home about. And so when you're 27.6% below your denominational average, that causes me significant pause. So that's something to wonder about. Your 2017-2018 budget is $310,000. The good news is you gave more than that in 2016, so that's good news. You have no debt, which is good. Let me say that in spite of the numbers that I've shared with you, I still think there's an incredible amount of hope and possibility here. We'll say more about that as we go on. I do not think, personally, that you as a congregation are in free fall. I think you're drifting, maybe wandering. You're losing a little bit of altitude, but I think we can discern some reasons for that, perhaps. But you're not in free fall. We could go on a field trip, if you had the stomach for it, and visit some churches that are in free fall. This church has energy. As I walked in just a few minutes before the service and sat in my pew and closed my eyes and just listened and prayed, but I was listening. There's a hum here, activity, conversation. There's a buzz here, if you will. In a church that's dead, you don't hear anything except for if there's some music being played, something like that. So I take that as a great deal of hope, personally. You do not have a formal endowment. Now, I'm going to talk about this right toward the end. And I promised Bryant, by the way, that we'd be out of here by 5:30, so I will stay till 5:30 if you've got questions and want to talk, but I'll let you out earlier than that, I promise. Having an endowment is hugely important if you expect people to leave you a bequest gift. Now, some persons might leave a bequest without your having a formal endowment. I probably would not, personally, but many might, hopefully. I had 78 respondents to this question related to tenure here. And the reason for that number is I had a number of couples. One of the things to remember as you read through the comments is that not everyone answered each question, number one. And number two, you might find this hard to believe, I met with some couples who had different responses to any given question. I know. Hard to believe, but it's true. A couple of things about the tenure here that surprised me. The average tenure is not too far off from a third of a century, 28.01 years to be specific about it. The range of tenure was 2 years to 68 years. So the good news first. The good news is that this represents an incredible amount of stability and constancy here at Milford Presbyterian. 6 respondents, 7.7%, had been here, a part of the congregation, for 5 years or less. That is a flag. 30.8% have been a part of the congregation for more than 40 years. In a congregation that's thriving and growing, I would expect to see a much higher percentage of people who've been here 5 years or less. 5 years is a long time, especially if you're talking about somebody who's 35 years old. 5 years is a good chunk of their professional or adult life. Okay? So that's a flag, a caution flag. A couple of people suggested that it's cliquey, their word, not mine, and hard to get in here. That's a quote. That's understandable after you run these numbers. Now you're friendly, almost, not everyone, but many people suggested, many of my informants anyway, suggested that you were a friendly congregation. And that's good. Friendly can be subversive to natural cliquishness, if you will. It's not that way by nature. You can be friendly with one another and not open or receptive to people who are guests. I was encouraged in a way, right toward the beginning of the service, that you did this, I call it a ritual, that we used to do in Texas a lot. Although in Texas, we didn't call it the passing of the peace or anything quite as formal as that. We called it the hug and howdy. How many of you are introverts by nature? Any of you? That's very, very interesting. I've got maybe 10 hands that went up. One of the most painful parts of a service to us introverts is the hug and howdy. And in fact, it's so painful that I tell pastors and church leaders, if you want to grow your church, one of the first things you can do is dispense with that. Now, I'm not saying don't be friendly and don't be welcoming and don't give people hugs and talk to them, how are you doing today? But you don't have to be prompted to do that. It's very, very uncomfortable for introverts. I'm thinking that one of two things is the case. Either there are more introverts than self-selected by raising your hand. That's a pretty common introvert trait. That was a test and you didn't know it, right? But it's also possible that maybe the friendliness of this church and the way that you go about it perhaps might screen out introverts. Just a thought. Moving along, my first impressions when I look at the narrative questions is that there's hope and possibility here. People love this church. Some of you have been around here a good while and you've been loving on this church for a long time. When I asked the question, what word or phrase best characterizes your understanding of what this church is all about? People said friendly. They said it's conservative, it's traditional, it's the church on the corner. People said, this is my family. Numbers of people shared that with me. The congregation is perceived, self-perceived, to be accessible, open, and welcoming to all. Some people think that you're gradually receiving some newer, younger members and their families. A couple of people responding suggested that the congregation has declined some over the years, becoming, in a couple of people's words, older and tired. Maybe that's the case, maybe not. This is a place of spiritual refreshment and a place of spiritual guidance here in the village and beyond. When I ask, what do you feel is the most significant opportunity facing this congregation today? The dominant opportunity theme in the responses to question number 4 have to do with growth. To attract and engage younger people and families. Now, in this question, as well as throughout the survey responses, the challenges of an aging facility and a lack of parking are mentioned by several people. I believe that if you desire to reach younger people, you must address those two barriers. You cannot expect, in today's culture, to thrive in terms of your ability to reach younger people if there's not a place for them to conveniently park and if your facility looks and feels tired. So those are challenges and barriers. Personally, I believe that your number one asset moving forward is your location, right here in the heart of the village. I would encourage you, and again, this is to Brian's point about being more than just about this finances related to your project. This is free here. I would encourage you to focus 90% or better, if you can, of your ministry and mission, dollars included, right here in the village, at least for the next 3 to 5 years. That's not to negate the importance of anything that you're doing in other parts of the county or around the world. It's just to say, I wonder how many people who might drive by here on a weekly basis really know what's going on in here? How present are you in the life of the village? I'd also suggest that you not, this is just a general ministry principle, I'd also suggest that you not send money any place, whether it's up the street or somewhere across an ocean, Africa or somewhere, that you not send any quote-unquote mission money anywhere where you do not also have Milford Presbyterian members who are rolling up their sleeves, figuratively and literally, and helping make a difference in that ministry. When you begin to focus your energy and your dollars in that way, people's awareness of this church will extravagantly increase. So I think there's an opportunity to grow and to remain relevant right here in this village and beyond. What excites you the most about the congregation? Question 5. People in the relationships that you share here are the core of Milford Presbyterian and the root of much of the quote-unquote excitement that's expressed in response to this question. Now, I use that word very intentionally, what excites you the most about the conversation. And some folks, in my mom's generation particularly over the years, I found they will sort of pause and they'll say, well, I don't know about exciting. One person told me one time at a different congregation, they said, well, excitement's not a word that I use much anymore. Fair enough. The thing that concerns me reading through all the comments that were expressed is that the thoughts expressed in response to this question are rooted predominantly inside this community of faith. I didn't hear a lot about excitement, for example, about what you were doing out in the community or even, somewhere else in the United States or out in the world. I would suggest to you that there are some differences of opinion here, as there are in any church, right? Some people thought that it was ridiculous to even talk about having an elevator. Others thought, my goodness, that's a refreshing idea. It would be helpful to some of us who have problems getting up and down the stairs. And there were some other polarities that were noticed that I mentioned to your session the other night. I mentioned that one of the themes that I heard is that we need more younger people, we need younger families. It's a fair question then to ask, what makes us a place here that families would want to come and grow and raise their families? I would suggest that once you have a clear answer to that question, or really a cluster of questions, that's the place to start. If David says to me, well, we really need young families, and I say, well, David, that's great. Why would young families want to come here? And David says, oh, easy question. Boom, 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 boom. You're well on your way to beginning to set some goals and targets for reaching younger people. But until you can answer that question, you're not quite ready. Because they're going to be asking a lot of questions. What's here for me? What's here for my family? And I think there's a lot here, but you just need to drill down and identify what it is that makes this place special. And I'd also wonder, what sort of a target do you have, or goal? How many young families are you trying to reach every year here? I would suggest until you have a specific number in mind, it's going to be hard to implement an action plan. Just a thought. The strengths that you have, the openness, the strength of the music ministry, I was impressed by your music today, all across the board, from your choir to your accompanist, organist, very talented, to the children who sang and played the bells. And A couple of you might know me just a little bit of enough to know that I don't impress very easily, particularly when it comes to music. I was at a church one time, and my suggestion in all 3 of their services was that they not do any music. It's funny, I had silence when I said that. Nobody laughed. And I didn't say that to be funny. I mean, it was terrible. Their contemporary service, quote unquote, their traditional service, and the one that was kind of a hybrid in the middle, the music was poor, borderline pitiful. So I thought they could have a much more effective outreach if they just didn't have any music for a while, until they kind of get that together. That is not the case here. You have excellent music, I would say. I don't know if today's normal or a little off kilter normal. That's awesome. It's the kind of place where people can thrive and really be excited about the music and the role that that plays in our culture, particularly young people. For many younger folks, music is a driving value. It's a part of their culture. And so churches that realize this do well. Churches that don't tend to struggle. And furthermore, churches that realize that young people, and by that, you know, today I can say, you know, anybody younger than about 45 qualifies. But if we understand that those younger people speak a different language than we do, I believe that conversations about worship style are somewhere between detrimental and not helpful at all. I think it's better to think about your service this morning as being in a particular language, let's say French. So native French speakers understand what was going on in worship. Someone who might speak Portuguese or Italian might be a little lost in your service. From a stylistic point of view, I think it's more helpful to talk about language. Let me go on. How familiar are you with the renovation plans? A majority of those responding, 61%, said that they were familiar at some level with the projects that you have on the table. The challenge going forward is going to be to help people understand at a deeper level how the projects connect with Milford Presbyterian's vision for the future. One of the things that is helpful for church leaders to recognize is that, particularly with persons my age and younger, they do not give to the what. They give to the why. Now, my mom would give just because the church needed money. That's fairly common in her generation. It is not at all common in my generation. And God help the churches when they're trying to, literally, when they're trying to connect mostly with people younger than me. Because they've got a ton more questions than I ever would think of when it comes to how the church spends its money, how the church invests in its building, and so on and so forth. So I think it's good. You had 61% of the folks who said they understand what you're trying to accomplish at some level. How supportive are you of the decision to conduct a capital campaign in order to fund these projects? This is the most important question that I asked, by far. The good news is 90% of those responding are supportive or very supportive of the initiative to run a capital campaign to fund some or all of these projects. What I'm looking for at a baseline minimum is 65% in response to this question. 65% being very supportive or supportive. I know from experience that when we have about 65% support for a capital campaign, that we can have a successful effort, number one, and that number two, many of the folks who are in that other group who are either not supportive or in some cases, you may find this hard to believe, actually very negative and antagonistic about the project moving forward. Church people, go figure. But we know that over time, if we're doing a good job communicating with the capital campaign and the projects that they represent, that many of those persons move in their support and become supporters of the effort. So your very, very strong response in favor of this project at 90%. Let me say a couple of words about leadership. The question is, do you feel that the church's leadership is appropriate for this season in the congregation's life? We had a 97% positive response with regard to your pastor. And after today, I can see a little bit more why that is. There were two responses, 3% of the responses, who said, no, I really don't think pastoral leadership is appropriate for this season in the congregation's life. We had a 96% affirmation with regard to lay leadership. That's very, very strong. Very strong. So I think you're in good hands here as far as leadership is concerned. And I've got some more things that I comment about in the survey, but I'll let you read that on your own. When we ask the question, would you prayerfully consider a 3-year gift in order to support the campaign? 58% of people that responded to this question said, yes, I would prayerfully consider. I made it clear, at least with those with whom I was sitting in a direct interview situation, that this is not a commitment. This is an indication of, would you pray? Well, sure, people will pray. 58% said yes. I found it interesting. I don't really have anything to say about this. 6 respondents said, no, I won't pray about that. Okay. So I think that's strong. When I ask in question 14, would you consider including Milford Presbyterian Church in your will or estate planning? The 13%, 8 households, said yes, we already have, even without an endowment. That's awesome. 11 more households, 18%, said I would. I'd consider it. One of the reasons why persons make bequest gifts to any organization is that they're asked to do so. And so my encouragement, March 1st is coming up on Thursday, so that might be a little quick, but at least by the 10th of March, you could have a formal endowment set up here at Milford Presbyterian, and then we could begin to work toward asking those persons for consideration. Having an endowment significantly increases your ability to get a gift, because people know that they're giving that gift for the long-term viability of the congregation. It's not subject to a particular leadership group's whims over time. It's secure, it's able to continue to serve and bless the church long, long into the future. John? Question, yeah.
Some of us know what an endowment is, and when you say endowment, they're like, okay. And some of us are like, I kind of know what that means, but I'm not real sure.
An endowment is, to be simple, is a legal entity that's set up with a group of trustees or kind of a management team in the church. And the endowment becomes a vehicle where people can invest funds, invest their bequest, if you will, that they can leave. Somebody can give a gift in their life, write a check, they can leave an estate gift. They might leave their entire estate to the church. The point is that those funds are held in that endowment, and the principal of which, in every case, is secure. So the church would receive proceeds off the endowment, and but be unable, as a general rule, to touch the principal. And so it's secure. How long has this church been here? Remind me, somebody.
1836.
Okay, 1836. I'm baffled, to be honest about it, that a church this old doesn't have an endowment. I wonder if you might have had one in the past and something happened to it. I've got a church right now that I'm working with up in Minnesota, and they're, in rough terms, their endowment holds a little over $3 million in the endowment. And they haven't been around, they've been around since the 70s. Okay. But at any rate, the point I want to make with that, it's not about the endowment, it's about the fact that every year, that church receives over $100,000 in proceeds from the endowment to go toward mission and ministry in their community. Now, it takes a little while, obviously depending on the folks that might invest in that endowment one way or the other, but it takes a little while to get to a $3 million balance. But this church has been around since the 70s, and they've been very intentional about asking for the consideration of a bequest gift. So, I hope that's helpful. I want to move on to my conclusion here. I believe, as far as the campaign bottom line, and I'm phrasing this in my head as, and you can call it what you want if you decide to move forward, obviously, but I'm calling it the Energize Our Future campaign. I think you do have a bright future, as I've said. I tried to say it several different ways. I believe you can have a successful campaign right now in the range of $500,000 to $550,000. Now, let me say this. I'm conservative in my estimates of what you can raise. It does you and me personally and the group that I represent, Horizon Stewardship, absolutely zero benefit to artificially inflate that number. It's not uncommon for me to have somebody, usually on our campaign steering team, since that's the group that I work most closely with on projects like this, who come up to me after Commitment Sunday and say, well, John, they kind of, usually they're smiling, I don't know what that means, but they usually say, well, John, you really missed it. You know, you said we could raise X and we raised X plus. And my standard response would be, well, David, is that a problem? Oh, no, I just wanted you to know you missed the estimate. I'm okay with that. I interviewed at a friend of mine's church, a large church in suburban Fort Worth, Texas, and about 2 weeks later, I talked to Jack, my friend, on the phone. And he said, yeah, I said, I was going to call you. That's never good, right? And he said, we decided to go with XYZ firm. And I said, okay, they do good work. You know, they're still in business. I thought, I don't know how, but they're still in business. At any rate, I said, Jack, what was the deciding factor? And Jack said, oh, he said, it was very impressive to our board. They told us we could raise $3.5 million. That's the point at which I laughed. I mean, this is a large church. I said, well, Jack, did they have access to anything other than the data that you sent me? Oh, no, you know, everybody who interviewed had the same data. And I said, well, Jack, I don't see any way that you can raise that kind of money. You know, my guess would be 1.3, 1.5 tops. Time passes. Jack was a dear friend of mine. Still would be. He passed away a few years ago, so not because of this incident. But dear friend, and come to find out, they raised right at 1.3 million. Now, a couple of things that taught me, you know, you can blow a lot of smoke and maybe get a gig, but I guarantee you, they wouldn't hire that group again. Because they were planning on, they had plans for that, you know. $3.5 million, they were ready to go. So, I believe you can have a successful campaign. Let me say a couple of things Well, first of all, any questions about anything I've covered so far? I want to share really quickly and have you out of here by 12:15 unless there's a lot of questions. Any questions about anything you've heard from me so far?
What's your perception of podcasts? I find them very beneficial, but do you know if they hurt a church? Because then people don't come to church and then probably don't feel they have to give. But I mean, I really like them, but I'd be interested, that's something we started a couple of years ago, and could you give us a little feedback on that?
Well,
repeat the question, please.
The question is, what do I think about podcasts? And do I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, do I think that they negatively impact church attendance? Maybe. I don't think so. I don't think they negatively impact church attendance. I think they're very, very helpful for people who are shut in, for people who can't get out, for people who might be traveling. Particularly when you have someone who's saying things that are helpful to hear, like my perception of Brian. You know, I have a lot of questions when I walk into a church, and I probably have more today than I did 6 months ago about Milford Presbyterian, but when I'm reading and hearing all the positive feedback about your pastor, I'm thinking, really? Really? And so, you know, I came today with a great deal of expectation. I think, really? Yeah, he's got a lot to say. I don't think it impacts attendance. If somebody's just looking for a good, you know, a good message, if you will, encouraging thoughts, spiritually, obviously, Bryant is in great company. You know, you can go online this afternoon, and in many places, hear some of the finest preachers in the world, either online in some way, whether it's a formal podcast or not. It's not the point, but I mean, their messages are there. What people come here for is part of what you have here, and that is friendship. The Christian word for that is koinonia, which is often mistranslated in our English Bibles, my personal opinion as pastor, as fellowship, quote unquote. That's a tremendously terrible translation. Koinonia is used by the Apostle Paul, I think exclusively in the New Testament, but it means shared life together. And churches that are able to offer that shared life together as a matter of habit and course, those churches are growing, because that's something that you don't find much in our culture today, is shared life together. Some people find it in their family of origin. Many of us never experienced that sort of thing in our family of origin. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if leverage and amortized debt has been eliminated as a possibility, or is that still a possible feature of this plan?
I have not heard a formal decision about debt here or phasing your project, either one. I think, and I don't know, I'm speaking out of turn maybe, but I think the thought is we have this range of projects, and let's see what the feasibility study suggests. There's nothing on the table that you can't accomplish in 2 capital campaigns. My encouragement to any church is that you be very careful, profoundly careful, about incurring debt. I could point you to some horror stories. I'll spare you a few of them. But the point is that I don't believe that a church should incur any debt at all that they cannot hope to eliminate in 6 to 8 years. That would mean 2 back-to-back capital efforts, maybe with a year or 2 in between the 2. Now, some churches are profoundly debt averse, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think they lose some opportunity to move forward. I've had some churches that say, we're not going to incur any debt with this project. We're going to accomplish the pieces of this project or the expansion or whatever it happens to be when we have cash in hand. And that's one approach. Other congregations would flip to the pole and say, well, you know, I've took out a 30-year mortgage on my house. Why can't we do that as a church? So there's a lot of room in the middle there. So I don't think there's been a formal decision. I would encourage your leadership, your session, to, alongside the Property and Finance Committee, to actually answer that question with regard to these projects that are on the table. What is your position about debt? Are you going to be cash and carry, or, you know, incur some debt? Some churches won't even incur any construction financing for that reason. Now, I really think that it's a lost opportunity in some cases, but I do think you need to be careful about debt. We could talk until 4:30 this afternoon about churches that, when I show up, I'm trying to deal with the mess that's in front of me often, and sometimes, well, probably most of the time, the church trauma that I deal with has to do with a well-intentioned group of people, presumably, who had the best interests of the church in mind, supposedly, at some point in the rearview mirror where they incurred all this debt. And it's killing them in some cases. So, any other questions? Take one more question. Yes, sir.
I just want to speak to the fact that I've been here for less than a year, so I'm a fairly new member. So just to get my perspective
Sure.
on the church where it comes to where you mentioned a little bit of the clickiness, where here what I see is 40 years, 50 years, sometimes 60 years, sometimes even 70 years of friendships that have built and people have stayed here, and the staying power of this church. And then also just speak a little bit to Billy Graham, who just passed away, who gave the simple message that God loves you, and so do I.
Right.
And I've had nobody here who hasn't reached out to me in a very powerful way. So as we move forward, and updates, and the church being, I'm a carpenter, so I know the church needs to be healthy, and the windows and all this stuff, and even the outfitting, and outreaching to the community too, so I agree with that. So just as moving forward, I would love to see progress, but I would love, love, love to see the church stay the way it is also.
Thank you for that. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if this fits into this discussion or not, but my thinking about bringing young people in, younger people in, might be that it might be possible to have a group of people who were dedicated to meeting and relating to younger families who come to church. For example, what can we do to help you? What can we do to help you settle in the community? What can we do to help you settle at the church? Do you need more of, whatever, here? And have a dedicated group that would be ready to do things like, drive somebody if they're looking, if they have problems with transportation when they first move to town or whatever.
So the comment was, maybe we have a group of people who are dedicated to this particular thought of engaging, attracting younger people. That's a great idea. In my view, you don't have any ministry initiative until you have a leader and a leadership team. My hunch would be, here at Milford Presbyterian, I could be wrong, my hunch is you're trying to do too much in terms of ministry program and the various initiatives that you're offering. If something's out of gas, you can push it or park it till you get some gas. My preference as a leader is the latter. Stand down ministries that are struggling, that don't have their own energy and forward motion. You don't have to stand them down forever, just until you get some fuel. Okay? And it might be a leader, it might be a team, whatever it might be. Let me share a couple things real quickly with you. Where do we go from here? Well, I think the landscape's a little confusing. I read an autobiography. I don't recommend the autobiography, really. It's pretty thick. But Anwar Sadat's autobiography had two brilliant things to say. This is one of them. So He said, "He who cannot change the very fabric of his thought will never be able to change reality and will never, therefore, make any progress." That's brilliant. Anwar Sadat, for some of you younger folks, being the former president of Egypt who was assassinated. At any rate, it could have been this sort of incendiary stuff that got him in trouble. But the point is, I want to challenge you to think differently and pray differently about this church and her future. The Apostle Paul, who some think that he was legitimately crazy, like insane crazy, said something absolutely ludicrous, in my view as a pastor, in Ephesians 3, verse 20 and following. I'm conflating 3 or 4 different translations here, but Paul said that God is able, to do exceedingly abundantly more than all that you can ask or imagine, even in your wildest dreams. Now, if you'll allow that perhaps he wasn't insane, I want to ask you, do you really believe that here at Milford Presbyterian? Because if you do believe that, like I do, it's time to get super serious about praying and asking and imagining and dreaming about what God can do here as you look to the future. There's 3 opportunity points. Number 1, I think you need to clarify and communicate, and I've thought more about this since the session meeting on whatever day that was this week, but clarify and communicate big picture vision. Where's this church headed? I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that question yet. In what ways are you being called to be salt, light, and leaven, which is what Jesus seems to suggest is the purpose of the people of God in the world, at least in part. But in what ways are you being called to be salt, light, and leaven in the village and beyond? Secondly, ensure sustainability. This congregation has been here a long time. I'm not a prophet, but I can tell you it won't be here for as many years into the future as it has been years in the past, unless you change your trajectory. I believe if you had 2 services next Sunday instead of just 1, you would have more people in attendance within a month. Why? Because there's a place for them to sit. That's important. If you want people in the pews, you've got to have a pew space in which they need to sit. Determine what the long-term facility needs are. Does this $1 million top end, does that include everything that this facility will need over the next 25 to 35 years as best you can project it, or not? Personally, before I would spend $1 million, I would want to know, what's this facility need long-term? Because if it needs 1.4 million, I'm picking numbers out of the hat, then I could say, yeah, let's invest in it. If it needs 3.8 million total, ultimately I'd say, whoa, let's wait a minute. Is this the place to invest our money? So you got to know what the big picture is ultimately. So I'd want, if you haven't had it already, I'd want somebody who knows their stuff about older facilities, and I'd want them to come in here and pick through this place with a fine-tooth comb. Because I want to know what's the bottom line. What's this going to cost me? You need to solve the accessibility barriers. We talked about that. And I think you need to provide somewhere between 40 and 60 contiguous parking spaces. Because the reality is, how many of you walk here on a routine basis? 3? Okay. And then finally, I want to encourage you to foster increasing engagement. Mobilize all 469 of your members. Clarify what it means to be a member here. You need an infrastructure, desperately, I believe, that ensures that every member, constituent, and guest has a place to belong and a place to serve. Every person cared for, every person connected. That's the goal. There are a series of core systems in every healthy church that can be boiled down to these 6. the welcoming systems, how we're getting the word out about this church, how we're welcoming people in, connecting, how we're actually plugging people into relationship and connection in this church, plugging them into ministry and mission. Communication, how we're communicating both internally and externally about the church. Discipleship, how are we growing people here? And then caring. The older a congregation gets, the more you have to dramatically amp up the level of care. And I can tell you, and again, I'm not a prophet, but your pastor cannot provide care to 469 people. Now, he's awesome. You know, the little bit that I know him, he's awesome. He's got a lot of capacity, but I don't think he can do that. If you're going to rely on the pastor to care for 469 people, you need to hire a couple more full-time pastors. If you believe that a lot of that care, like I believe, can be conducted by gifted laypersons who God has equipped for the ministry of caring, then there are some systems that you can put in place. And then finally, outreach and mission really is a system that needs some attention. And when I use the word mission, I am not talking about money that's sent somewhere. I'm talking about activity. I'm talking about physical presence. That's mission to me. Any thoughts in conclusion? And I'll let you out a few minutes past the promised 12:15. Anything at all? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I hesitate to even get involved because I have just enough knowledge to be dangerous. And also, I'm a big proponent of don't complain unless you're going to help. So, that said, I don't know if this has already been thought of, but there's a gold mine down the street that is being built. The apartments, aren't they condos, something where there's people are moving in. If there is a verbiage created that you were talking about that people could use, whether it's a flyer, whether it's, you know, come and see what we have to offer, it's within walking distance. It's supposed to be, I don't know, but younger people, they're lofts, I think, or however they're being advertised. And maybe you guys have this already on the table. But I think that it is a gold mine down the street. And that would be the outreach, the come and see what we're all about. We're wonderful people here. So I was talking to my husband the other day. How do you get people to know? I can't go up to someone and say, hey, come into my church.
Yes, you can.
No, I
okay, maybe you can.
I don't have the verbiage. You give me the verbiage and I have 50 people in here. But
awesome, we got a little
I'm not see, that's the thing. I don't like people that complain unless they're going to do something about it.
Sure.
Which, if I had the artillery, the whatever, I would be happy to do something, but
I wrote your name down, Terry.
I know. Sorry, but I really, I mean, I was a Girl Scout leader, Boy Scout leader. It's like, if you're not going to do something, don't come to me to complain.
Right.
So that's kind of how I feel. But I would be happy to help that if I had the confidence in what I was doing to go do that. Right now, I would be, they'd go, you know, I'm not going to your church. It's silly. Because I wouldn't know what to say. But if you get something going, somebody that uses bigger words than me or whatever, I would love to get those people what they're supposed to be, younger people.
Right.
Walk here and get 2 services. I love that because I want to golf. I want to go to golf. I want an 8 o'clock. I'd like a 6 o'clock service, but at 8 o'clock we come, we say our piece, we go golfing.
Well, I'm pretty sure if you had a 6 o'clock service, there'd be plenty of room there. The point is, there's a dynamic and an energy here. I wouldn't have a problem, one, just after a brief visit, saying to my friend David, and David's really opposed to coming to a church, but I would say, David, you really need to I'm just picking on you, David. You really need to come and visit. And he would be like, you know, I'm not much into that anymore. I grew up in a church and whew, I'm still getting over that. I'm putting words in your mouth. But what I would say to David is very, very simple. I would say, David, you owe it to yourself and your family just to come one time. Just once. That's all you need to say to somebody. And I believe that the dynamic that you have here would take care of the Davids, if you will, figuratively, if you can get them in the door. One time. Because there's energy here.
And I think you need to compete with the other churches by having a Saturday night service or something like that, so that if there are things to do on a Sunday, that clears your calendar. I mean, that's the way it is nowadays, whether you like it or not. People have things to do on the weekends.
Absolutely. There were a couple more comments, and then I'll close you out in prayer. Yes, ma'am.
What are you suggesting, or are you suggesting, Amy, when you talk about parking? For example, I can see there's a restaurant on the corner that keeps going out of business. If we could buy that property, we'd have parking, some parking space.
Right.
But you'd have to buy the property, and it's probably expensive.
Well, let me say this. And I don't know everything there is to know about property. But what I would say is if you're planning on being here, I don't know, let's shorten it up. Let's say 20 to 50 years. You cannot afford to not buy any property that's available. Churches generally can say one of two things about property. I've heard it. We could have bought that once. Or, we used to own that. But we sold it. Unless there's some sort of a major upheaval, and then this becomes a moot point, I suppose. As long as people are driving, they're going to need a place to park if you expect them to come to your church. Particularly, I heard from some people who self-proclaim to be older. One person essentially said, this is paraphrase, it's not safe for people our age to be wandering around after dark. Now, a clear solution would be to not have any activities after dark. Seriously. But if you do, I wouldn't want my mom, you know, parking 2 blocks away, and much less in the winter. It's just not safe. I mean, from a fall position, right? Never mind, I'm sure it's a very, like, safe place in terms of overall safety. I wouldn't be so much worried about my mom getting accosted necessarily as I would about her falling. Okay? So, you know, can you afford not to buy it? Would be one question to think about. Yes, ma'am?
But you're saying you should, about affording not to buy it, but then you're saying don't get yourself into debt.
Yep.
That parking lot down the street is going to get us into debt.
Okay.
I mean, it's not, there's no property around here that's not going to get us into debt.
Well, then maybe you want to think about doing something different. You know, doing nothing is an option, certainly. If I was to, you know, I believe from my experience, and then this will be my concluding statement, and then I'll pray. I'll stay till 4:30 if you want to talk, but I'll let you go. I promise. What I've learned over the years is that people are willing to invest, often sacrificially, in their church if they think it's going to be a good investment. I routinely have donors ask me, what do you think the return on this investment is? Now, my mom would never ask that question. My generation might get around to that question relatively soon. My kids' generation, the older kids, I've got kids all across the spectrum, but the older kids, that'd be one of their first questions. What's the payout? What are we investing in? If you can demonstrate that there's momentum, that there's motion, that there's a clear vision, people will move, in my experience, generally move beyond a token gift to a serious gift to help make things happen relative to their overall capacity. People, as I said, don't give to your project. People give primarily for 4 reasons to any nonprofit. Number 1, they give because they believe in the vision of that organization. And what that really translates into is they give because they're passionate about the vision. They want to help the organization, in this case Milford Presbyterian, really move into that, living into that vision. Number 2, people give because they have confidence in the leader or leadership of the congregation. Often, it's because they perceive that they have a personal relationship with the lead leader. In this case, it's Bryant. Okay? Number 3, people give because they have confidence in the fiscal responsibility of the organization. One of the hardest campaigns I've ever run, I ran this last year in Minnesota. They had had 2 very prominent cases of pastoral indiscretion within the last, say, 15 years at the outside. They'd also had a situation where they had had a lady, I'm not making a gender comment here, but a lady had absconded with some serious money. And it, sort of the graft, if you will, had been going on for quite some time before they caught it. And so what that did is that severely undermined my point number 2, that confidence in leadership, they just didn't have any. And number 3, undermine their confidence in the fiscal responsibility of the organization. That was a hard, hard campaign. And then the 4th reason that people give is that they're asked for the consideration of a gift. So, thank you again for being my informants. Those of you who did, it's been a delight to get to know that there's a church like this sort of in the neighborhood. This is kind of in my backyard as my work goes. So I'm thankful for that opportunity. And my prayer for you as you become more like that tabernacle that Bryant preached this morning is that God will sort of light you on fire spiritually, not physically. Let's pray. God of grace and God of Milford Presbyterian Church, I'm grateful for the honor and blessing that it has been for me personally to get to know this good church a little bit better. I pray for each person in this room today and those that they represent. I pray for Bryant and his family. I pray for those who are serving on session and in other leadership capacities here. I pray that you would bless them with clarity of thought and vision, and that you would bless them with boldness moving forward, is my prayer in the name of Christ.